Hey, this is Julian Sanchez, and you're listening to the WatchCats Weekly News Roundup. First off today, we've got a story from the Washington Post headlined GOP balks at approving even a fraction of Musk's DOGE cuts. Lead there tells us the administration officials are running into resistance not just from Democrats, but also congressional Republicans who have made it clear that it will be very difficult to codify even a tiny fraction of the measures that Musk's DOGE team has unilaterally implemented. This is sourced with a bunch of lawmakers and aides. The significance here is, when we talk about how much money is DOGE saving, which we'll get to in a second, none of that is really locked in until it's actually reflected in congressional appropriations. Otherwise, you run into what a lot of people are already describing as a kind of constitutional crisis where Congress says we've appropriated X dollars to be spent in the following ways, and the executive branch says, sorry, Congress, we don't care. If you actually want, real savings in the long term, if you really want money in the Treasury that is not obligated and that could be used to fund, reductions in taxes or other priorities, Congress needs to validate that. And what is demonstrated, at least according to the sources for this Post article, is, legislators are not on board with a lot of the dramatic cuts that DOGE has been making. So that is something to keep an eye on as the White House's budget proposal moves forward. And that links to, did you have something to jump in with there?
I was just saying, we're starting to see a turnaround in Congress on other issues as well. For example, Rand Paul got up to argue vociferously against the tariffs and in support of multiple bills that would start to hem in President Trump's unilateral ability to levy those tariffs. So the related concept here is President Trump unilaterally saying, I don't have to spend the money Congress appropriates, and on the other hand saying, but I do have the unilateral power to effectively impose taxes through tariffs.
Right. A lot of this administration's policy has proceeded with, let's say, dubious invocations of emergency authorities, ranging from tariffs to deportation policy under the Alien Enemies Act, which really is supposed to involve invading armies in wartime, not criminal gangs. So this question of the savings is related to an issue we've broached a number of times on WatchCats in the past, and will no doubt be doing again in the future, which is what is the net savings here? And I thought it was pretty interesting to see in the New York Post an opinion piece by Jessica Riedel of the very conservative Manhattan Institute. The Manhattan Institute is where folks like Chris Rufo hang their hat. In the New York Post, Jessica Riedel writes, despite faux fanfare and outrage, DOGE hasn't even scratched the federal budget monster. And she's noting there is, on the one hand, the kinds of cuts they're making don't touch the places where most of the money gets spent in the federal budget, which is to say defense, healthcare, and entitlements. The verifiable amount they've saved, and she notes, the amount they're currently claiming to have saved, $160 billion, which is far short of the trillion that was the initial goal, is mostly unverified. And of the stuff that is verified, meaning there's some description of what the actual savings came from, there are just huge obvious errors there. Canceled contracts being counted multiple times, and also there's the flip side. We've talked before about whether DOGE's savings claims hold up to scrutiny. But there's the additional question of what costs is DOGE imposing? And Riedel mentions the cuts at IRS being likely to reduce tax revenue by reducing the agency's ability to do tax enforcement, to hunt down underreporting of tax obligations. But there's also, we have a couple stories here from the New York Times and CBS about an analysis from the Partnership for Public Service, which says, or which estimates that DOGE's cuts, just looking at costs related to reductions in the federal workforce, are going to end up costing taxpayers about $135 billion, which is getting pretty close to the $160 billion probably inflated figure that DOGE is claiming they've saved. And that's because there are costs associated with putting thousands of employees on paid leave and lost productivity because there's a lot of chaos involved in the kind of reshuffling and reorganization that they've imposed. And also because, again, we're seeing in many cases they're firing people without looking too closely at what those people's function is and how necessary they are. And so then they end up having to expend money rehiring people they realize they shouldn't have fired in the first place, or again, losing productivity because it turns out that if you make some of these cuts, the agency can't do things that it needs to do. And that creates costs in the long term as well. Notably, this analysis does not include costs like legal defense against lawsuits, because many of these actions are of dubious legality, and it costs money to fight a lot of lawsuits in federal court. And again, the costs of lost tax collection and lost enforcement revenue, because IRS staff have been cut, because agencies that, for example, collect fines from companies that have been found to engage in misconduct have been cut. So these are all sorts of net cost that we need to weigh against the amount that DOGE claims that it is saving. I should note here the Partnership for Public Service is itself, it's described as a nonpartisan nonprofit, but it is a kind of advocacy group for the federal workforce. So, put an asterisk there. This is not a pure academic research institution with no skin in the game. Still, it is highly plausible, whether or not you agree with the exact figure, that these are real costs that need to be weighed against the amount DOGE claims to be saving.
Yeah, for all their talk that they wanted to bring people in who had experience with business into government, these are people who don't understand the fundamentals of being a responsible executive in the private sector, which is your HR and legal teams cost money. Pretty radical and shocking idea to many people who have actually not been on the front line of trying to run an organization. But speaking of the chief executive officer, since he is still not the official leader of DOGE, Musk has done a cluster of interviews recently. Some choice quotes from there, for example, from the case of Axios. Musk says DOGE may be here to stay. So again, going back to the original executive order that made DOGE, it was the idea of a 2-year organization that would then be sort of have a celebratory mission accomplished banner in July of 2026 and then close up shop. Legally, they could extend that out for another 2 years for the duration of Trump's term, and that I think is very likely to happen. Looking backwards instead of forwards, with a New York Times article looking back 101 days, Elon Musk sounds less confident about their goal. Not only has he not even come close to being on a trend line to get to the original $2 trillion worth of savings or the revision to $100 trillion of savings, about $58 billion of the claim savings haven't even been itemized yet and may not even exist, which brings the actual HR and legal costs of doing these costs into that much starker of a relief.
It is interesting to see the sort of the new tone we get from Musk in this most recent interview, and this is one where a lot of news organizations were present, so you can get a variety of different takes if you want to go kind of hunt down the full range of news organizations that were party to this. I think this is also the interview where he talked about DOGE being like Buddhism.
Yes, exactly. One of the things, and we covered that in our recent, rather in an episode you will hear soon on Monday or Tuesday, depending upon your subscription level, in an interview we did with Nathan Tankus. One thing I did get from this article I hadn't seen elsewhere is the claim, and I'm not sure if this is like substantiated anywhere, that the president told DOGE that there can be no changes, which is in fact what has happened, but supposedly that there can be no changes to either Social Security and Medicare, right, which account for about a third of federal spending. I don't know if that's true, but again, that makes the DOGE's job even more impossible, especially in the regards to the Defense Department, where they want the Pentagon budget to balloon to something like $1 trillion. We'll see if they actually get that.
Yeah, that would be which I think would be quite a record. It is a kind of weird combination of this imperative to cut lots of waste, and we have seen some contracts slated for cancellation at the Pentagon, but also taking one of the biggest sort of money sinks in the federal budget and saying actually even more for that function. But I guess we need to make sure that the tanks are well polished for President Trump's birthday parade.
Yeah. So next we have a whole cluster of stories around the slow dismantling. I mean, slow, pretty fast for government standards. The dismantling of the National Science Foundation. Article from USA Today: National Science Foundation eliminates hundreds of grants day after director resigns. This was a director appointed during the first Trump administration. Nature also confirming hundreds more NSF grants terminated. And Washington Post with an article that amid DOGE-induced turmoil, the National Science Foundation is in chaos. Fed scoop: how DOGE got into the National Science Foundation. Basically, what we're seeing here is the National Science Foundation funds around 11,000 to 12,000 grants out of like 30 to 40,000 applications per year. The federal government, just to give you an idea, and this isn't just from the National Science Foundation, although it's a big expenditure through the NSF, funds year over year on average at the moment like 38 to 40% of all basic research in the United States, full stop. And that's not just basic research of like actual science trying to produce additional discoveries. That has huge crossovers into the private sector because so much of our academic and science community have partnerships with the private sector. My first real job that wasn't like being a cart attendant at Target was actually an NSF funded grant to work in plant genetics at the University of Minnesota. And there's a huge amount of agribusiness which depends on a both sympathetic and symbiotic relationship with academia and the amount of R&D it does. So this is just to underline that there is going to be secondary consequences of all these cuts, which are going to further exacerbate tax receipts coming in from economic activity.
Yeah. Now, if you want a more sympathetic take on the cuts at NSF, where I think upwards of 1,000 grants have essentially been canceled, and the awarding of new grants has basically slowed to a crawl, if not a complete halt. National Review has a take under the headline, National Science Foundation cancels hundreds of grants to left-wing research projects. And, certainly it seems as though the cancellations here are targeted at grants that the administration views as left-wing or woke or DEI or whatever you want to call it. And I think it's worth, kind of putting a pin in that for a second, because there's also a response that I think is worth a look from House Democrats on the House Science Committee that is looking at those claims and trying to analyze whether that kind of characterization of the grants given out by NSF is fair. And look, probably in this mix, you would find stuff that you or I might say, hey, yeah, I'm not sure if this needs to be underwritten by taxpayer dollars. But it seems to me that the administration has been using a very sort of crude, keyword-based approach to identifying, woke or DEI grants. We've joked in the past about, some of the sort of ridiculous consequences of a kind of reflexive keyword-based approach where, for example, at the National Security Agency, they had to pull down a lot of internal documentation on their internal web about a certain kind of cyber attack called a privilege escalation attack, which is a very common form of cyber attack, because, well, it had the word privilege in it, and we all know privilege is a woke DEI term. And I think, when it comes to science grants, again, I assume some of these are probably things I would not have a problem with cutting. But if you look at a lot of research related, for example, to women's health is going to talk about gender, and is going to use vocabulary that's going to trigger those filters. If you think about research that looks at, for example, different population subgroups having different worse health outcomes, why, for example, poor people or certain racial minority groups might have worse outcomes in certain areas of health. Well, I guess that's an issue of health equity, and equity is a dangerous word, but that doesn't explain to my satisfaction why that's not, at least in principle, a legitimate subject of scientific inquiry.
Absolutely. And the important thing to remember, not just about NSF, but essentially, as far as I can tell, every single agency level DOGE initiative we have seen so far, it's not as if they're bringing in a conservative or right-leaning counter to the people making these policy decisions, making these funding decisions, being like, yeah, we're going to scale down all this nonsense, and we're going to put higher merit, higher value, higher impact stuff in its place, right? To your point, the NSF is not going to fund anywhere close on the current trend line 11,000 grants this year, right? I would be surprised if it's half. So they're not backfilling the capacity with merit because they actually have not hired anyone to make these decisions on the DOGE side who has the domain knowledge who would be able to do it. So all they can do is cut. A great example of the kind of people and how DOGE has been operating is a giant post from Anna Bauer at Lawfare. This is a must read and way too large to review in our news roundup. But Anna does an amazing job with a tremendous amount of primary evidence. There's like 4 or 5 complete emails in this chain, which just goes to show you an example of how, like we talked about with Attorney General Keith Ellison, is DOGE going to try to get around some of these laws? Are they going to try to get around the fact that the people making these decisions are not Senate confirmed, right? And therefore they're just advising the people that are to make the decisions. They're not even bothering with that fig leaf now. They're literally just ordering people in the government to do shit, right? To cancel contracts, to fire people, like in black and white, right?
Right.
So the more refined level of infiltration in many cases in government, and the example here was within Homeland Security and their Justice Management Division. They're just literally putting it in emails.
Right. And so for the folks who missed our interview with Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, was it Michigan? Minnesota, Attorney General Keith Ellison. The sort of legal fiction here is, well, it doesn't matter that none of these DOGE people making important decisions that are transforming the federal government are Senate confirmed, because really, these are guys who are acting in an advisory capacity. The actual decisions are being made by the agency heads who are in fact Senate confirmed. And what Anna Bauer at Lawfare points out is, well, if you look at the internal communications, that doesn't really seem to reflect the reality. What is actually happening here is, DOGE really is running the show, and to the extent that people at the agencies, don't agree with that, they're being steamrolled and told, no, DOGE is in charge. You have to implement their agenda. Related to that, NPR has a report on a new lawsuit filed this week by a bunch of the same labor unions and nonprofits that have filed some previous lawsuits against DOGE. But this is a broader one that's really saying the DOGE government overhaul writ large is unconstitutional because they are effectively usurping the power of Congress. Congress has appropriated funds to be spent in such and such a way. Congress created a bunch of federal agencies by statute, agencies like USAID, a whole lot of others that have effectively been reduced to nothing, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And so to the extent DOGE is de facto shutting these down and blocking spending Congress authorized, the project really is an unconstitutional usurpation of legislative power. A lot of the lawsuits we've looked at were sort of Administrative Procedure Act stuff. That kind of was a little bit more process oriented, and not that the process isn't important. But this one seems to get closer to sort of the heart of, hey, is this the executive branch's call to make, or are they fundamentally commandeering legislative powers.
That's exactly right. And we also have some articles from Rolling Stone and ProPublica, in the case of Rolling Stone, covering how FAA staff have been required to sign NDAs to keep the new project called Project Lift secret. It is strongly suspected this project will, again, move a lot of funds into Starlink. On the same topic of conflicts of interest, at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, in full transparency, I was a founder and employee there for many years. We were prohibited from owning stock in multiple companies and assets that would be impacted potentially by our decisions. Pretty standard ethical rule there. ProPublica has an article that old DOGE favorite Gavin Kleiger owns stock in Apple and Tesla, has a bunch of Bitcoin and Solana. And those are, of course, things the CFPB could theoretically take action on if it were re-engaged to do its legally mandated job. And he has not been required to divest from any of those personal financial interests, despite his executive level decision making at CFPB.
And so the thing to stress here is these are companies that specifically under the agency's ethical guidelines that, hey, if you're a senior official or any kind of official at CFPB, because that agency is actively regulating, the category of cryptocurrency and specifically these companies, hey, your investments cannot include stock in these companies because that would be a conflict. Kleiger, who is the one essentially gutting CFPB and orchestrating mass layoffs, is in violation of those rules, and so effectively undermining enforcement against companies that he holds stock in, and of course those enforcements might affect the values of his investments. A last handful of stories. Noah, do you want to take the lead on the nuclear secrets?
Sure. NPR a couple days ago was reporting that Luke Ferriter, the 23-year-old SpaceX intern and Adam Ramada, Miami-based venture capitalist, had accounts at the Department of Energy for some reason for at least 2 weeks, which gives them potentially access to nuclear weapon or like extra sensitive, super classified information. Why this access would be held, even if it was not used by DOGE staff, is completely beyond the pale. On the theme of DOGE removing bureaucratic and career level employees in the IT sector across the federal government in order to streamline their own endeavors, FedScoop with the news that both the Chief Information Officer and the Chief Information Security Officer of the Internal Revenue Service and Treasury Department, respectively, are taking buyouts and will be departing. And lastly, that DOGE is building a master database for immigration enforcement. According to CNN, this was a long-standing ask from people who don't particularly care that Congress has a role to say in which data systems should or should not exist, and whether or not the public can also have comments about whether or not these systems should exist. So this master database would be a connection between the Internal Revenue Service, the Social Security Administration, Health Human Services, along others. It is also being reported that this will likely be a Palantir build-out, which is the data analytics company founded by Musk ally Peter Thiel.
And so this is confirming and elaborating on reporting in Wired by previous WatchCats guest McKenna Kelly. So we urge you to look back at both her reporting and the new CNN update. I will say on the Treasury CIO and CTO story, I think this is significant just because, if not in isolation, but because there is a pattern here that if you've followed previous news roundups and previous WatchCats episode, you've heard us talk about, which is it really seems as though part of what is happening here is an absolute hollowing out of technical expertise within the federal government, and in particular, sources of technical expertise with deep experience that are outside DOGE. And this is concerning to us because you have, a bunch of young people with, who may be smart techies, but have very limited experience with these government systems and these government agencies going in and making radical changes, rewriting legacy code from scratch. and at the same time, the people with the experience to both understand technically what they're doing and to understand whether either, they might be breaking something or whether they might be making changes that open those systems to abuse. Those people are either firing because they object to what DOGE is doing and say it's a bad idea on security grounds or otherwise, or are sort of so demoralized that they see the writing on the wall and are being urged to resign. It is a problem, from my perspective, to be making the kind of radical changes we're seeing and then removing all of the people who have the ability to spot a problem and say, well, wait a minute. This kind of change could cause real serious problems. This kind of change could open the door to abuse. And you sort of have to ask yourself, well, why are they so eager for these people to be shown the door? That is our news roundup for Friday, May 2nd. Noah, it's quite an exhausting pile of stories.
Yeah, I'm not going to necessarily be disappointed if Elon Musk's part-time endeavor with DOGE means that we can take a step back and start digging deep on all the stuff that has happened instead of trying to drink from this incredible firehouse going forward.
Absolutely. Well, for deep dives, please stay tuned. Early next week, we'll have our interview in the next full WatchCats episode with writer Nathan Tankus. And join us again next Friday for another WatchCats News Roundup. I've been Julian Sanchez.
And I'm Noah Cunin.
Catch you next time.